All right. Thank you all for joining. I think we'll go ahead and start with just a little bit of an introduction to today's webinar as more people are joining. So I'll start just by reminding everyone that unless you're presenting or asking a question, please keep yourself muted during the program. Also, we will be recording today's presentation, and we will post that recording afterward for folks who may want to rewatch or have missed today's program. So just to start out, my name is Tamara Schwartz, and I'm one of the volunteers behind the Museum Expert project. This project is entirely run by volunteers, and there are a number of other folks from the volunteer team on today's webinar. So you may hear from some of them as we go along. As you're joining, you're welcome to introduce yourself. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. All right. Please introduce yourself in the chat. And so I'm going to just provide a brief introduction about Museum Expert for folks who may not be as familiar. This is a project that launched in fall of 2020. And it was created by a team of volunteers responding to the pandemic and the unprecedented disruption facing museums and museum professionals as a result. And the platform is intended to connect museum professionals with career resources and with networking opportunities and with employers. And help employers who are looking for skills and expertise, whether for short or long term. The Museum Expert team is continuing to develop partnerships with other organizations to offer programs and resources to support museum professionals. And we're continuing to enroll both museum experts and employers in the website. So if you haven't registered yet, on the website, visit museumexpert.org to do so, and you can create a profile there. And once you're registered, you'll receive our regular e-newsletter announcing future webinars and networking events and other resources. As I mentioned, Museum Expert is run by a team of volunteers. If you'd like to help.
They're going east.
Can I just ask everyone to please make sure you're muted? Thank you. So if you're interested in helping out, if you have ideas and you'd like to contribute to Museum Expert, please contact Walter Stavalos or one of the other volunteers and let us know that you're interested. So with that, I will introduce today's presenter. And we're really grateful to have Legare Settle today, who is a recruiter with Beacon Hill Staffing in New York. And she has more than 10 years experience assisting job seekers and employers to find great matches for talent. And she's going to talk with us today about what employers are looking for in today's job market, how to best present yourself, interview tips, and more. So she'll also make time to respond to specific questions that participants have. So as she's presenting, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat and making sure that we include time to answer those questions. So with that, I'll hand things over to Legare.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone being here today. As Tamara said, my name is Legare. It looks nothing like it's pronounced. I am from Charleston, South Carolina. I've been in New York for the past 10 years, and I work at a national staffing agency called Beacon Hill Staffing. I was connected with museumexpert.org through a sorority sister of mine, Ellen, who's also on this call. And one of my favorite things to talk about, interviewing, how to navigate the market. The past year has been such a difficult year for so many. And with me being on the phone with hiring managers every day, I've been doing a lot of seminars similar to this, of just a variety of things that could be helpful as everyone's navigating either looking for another position in the museum world, looking to change courses, kind of from a career perspective, looking for temporary work and the best way to do that. So I found that when I lead these seminars, the most helpful is if there are questions as I'm going through things, please just pop them into the chat. Colleen is going to be kind of helping filter them, and then will kind of stop me as we go through this presentation. I'm going to share my screen shortly. I have about 8 slides. I typically never do a PowerPoint because I usually just talk, and I enjoy things that are much more conversational, interactive. But I'm going to go through a few separate things about what to put on a resume and a cover letter, tips for virtually interviewing, and then I usually like to leave a good amount of time at the end for individual questions. But please, any questions as we go throughout this, just pop them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer any of them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty, so starting with navigating the lovely job market that we have right now, easier said than done, I know. I wanted to quickly chat about Beacon Hill Associates and Beacon Hill in general. We are a national staffing agency. We have placed many a candidate in the New York market that have been working at the MoMA, the Museum of Natural History, and short-term contract roles. We are in 63 different cities. So what I will do is make sure that my contact information is shared after this. So if you are looking for employment, short-term, temp to perm, or direct hire in a city that we have a division, I'd be happy to either work with you if you're in New York, or be able to pass you off to the appropriate person in the cities, depending on where you're looking. We have different divisions. I work on what's called our associates division. That can be marketing, business development, sales, fundraising. We have a finance and accounting team, a technology team, a life sciences team, and we kind of really run the gamut. I usually say, yes, it's important what's on your resume, but when you work with a recruiter, recruiters are sometimes the gateway into opportunities that aren't specific to your resume as well, based off of your core intangible skill set. You just have to find the right recruiter. Which can be difficult at times, but I did want to make sure that if there are any questions about Beacon Hill or anything that you would have, I'll make sure that Ellen or Colleen and Walter have my information and can send that to everyone who's on this call today. So in general, I wanted to start with resume, the worst. To be honest, I think that if someone tells me they love to write a resume, I'd love to meet that person, because this is like one of the, I think, the trickier things to do. This is very true. You have about 7.4 seconds for someone to read your resume, which is a really crazy statistic. You put weeks and weeks into writing one, and you send it out, and you have 7.4 seconds. So it's hard to think about, well, what are they actually looking for? So a few things that I like to point out. It is okay, especially for individuals that are on this call, to have multiple different versions of your resume. If you are looking for something that directly matches what you have done, have that as resume number 1. If you are looking for something that's going to be a bit different, less specific into kind of your background, have a different version of your resume, and make sure that you're going to get different, pieces of advice. I do think talking to people that are in HR and recruiting, or recruiters in general, are the best pieces of advice instead of family members. Whenever you are looking, they're good for review, but not good for sometimes advice on the versions of your resume. But having multiple versions is totally okay. I think that the actual format, this is where you'll get the most varying, I think, pieces of advice, to be honest. Anything longer than 2 pages is going to be really difficult for individuals to read. typically you would want a page to a page and a half. And yes, I do believe for this particular population, having some type of introduction will be important, kind of an overview, but nothing longer than 3 to 4 sentences, because you want your current experience or your most recent experience to be catching from an optical standpoint. So making sure that you're able, that, you know, when you're sending your resume out, you want probably a 25% down from the top of the page to be your first place of where you've worked. Not halfway down, not 3/4 of the page down. You really want to make sure that you're able to highlight it. So again, you have 7.4 seconds. What are they going to read? 3 to 4 sentences of your objective or your summary, and then immediately getting into some of the content of what you've done in your most recent role. So I do think that that is important. And I do think that the dates, you don't have to put months. You don't always have to put years for places, you know, from whenever you first started your career. But something that is important when you don't have dates on your resume, a lot of people will sometimes think, well, how long were you there? So I think making sure that the dates are always on there as well. And the creativity component, graphics are great. I love pictures. I typically don't recommend those for resumes, because you always have to think about, is this going to make or break someone calling me? Is this going to make or break someone wanting to pick up the phone to have a conversation? If the answer is no, then typically you don't want that on there. So you would want to spend a bit more time being able to really make it uniform, make it optically pleasing is the best way for me to describe that, and making sure that it's showcasing your skill set more than anything. The one other thing that I usually will point out, employers right now are preferring bullets instead of paragraphs underneath your jobs. And the reason is they're wanting to see, and they're going to be scanning again in this 7.4 seconds, what have you done? And a lot of the times in paragraphs, it's a bit trickier to read through an entire paragraph. Sometimes hiring managers might say, I don't have time to read through that. But when it's bulleted and you're able to highlight it, it's a bit more of a quicker read for them, and you'll get a few more seconds depending on that too.
Hey, Legare, we have a question from Erin. She wants to know a little bit more about how we can reconcile making sure we include all relevant keywords, skills listed in sometimes really wordy job descriptions.
Yes.
And the need to have a resume that's still easy to read.
Yeah, it's a great question, Erin, because that is not, it's, you know, if you're applying to LinkedIn, there is an algorithm. If you're applying on Monster, there are a lot of times algorithms that to be picked up on, or it's not even to be picked up on, it's to be put in different batches is how that works on the back end. So if, let's say it's a job description that's 3 pages, which I've definitely read those, you have to really think about, okay, what have I done that is actually on my resume? And that it's kind of not a game, but you have to think about what are going to be the have to haves versus the nice to haves when you're reading through that job description. Those are 2 very different things. If you're looking for a director position, really looking through and thinking about here are the requirements versus here are the nice to haves. Those keywords and the requirements are the ones you want to make sure in your actual bullets. So then from the algorithm, you'll get kind of placed in the first bucket instead of the second bucket. There's no rhyme or reason to knowing which ones they're going to pick up on, because it's also dependent on the company. Some companies are going to prioritize other things. So I think that you don't want to spend too much time thinking, is this one word going to allow my resume to be seen? Because that's not going to happen. It's better to think about, what have I done? And is this resume showcasing, and am I applying to things that are really going to pick up on my resume? And then making sure if there are certain words in the job description, if you could change some of the wordings around on your resume to be a little bit more relative to that, that's usually the best way to handle that.
Also, it seems like we have some questions about keywords. So when we're doing keyword search, when companies are doing keyword searches, in the example in the chat was photography versus photographing. Like, will both of those show up?
Usually get pulled. Yeah, because it's not a specific word. It's usually like with that, the algorithm behind the scenes, whenever I learned about this, because I had a lot of candidates asking me this. So I did a seminar with LinkedIn, and this is more specific to LinkedIn, not even on a website. Because if you're applying directly, there's not really an algorithm. If you're going to the direct company's website, if it's through LinkedIn or some other third-party platform, photography versus photo you'll still be populated because they've only put in its PHOT. So they're making sure that it's not going to throw you out for lacking or for having a different kind of way of saying the word.
Can you speak a little bit about adding dates to specific jobs you've held in the past? And is that something that's going to be counterproductive to a more experienced applicant? Will that scare folks off seeing older dates, or vice versa for new applicants?
Yeah, that is, and that's I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think that the most honest answer is that unfortunately there's discrimination that goes on both ends. You don't have the experience or you have too much, and that's just a very unfortunate answer. And I think that the best way for me to explain how to handle that for a more experienced candidate, you can have maybe your most 2 recent or 3 recent jobs, and then underneath put prior experience, and then just put the name of the place you worked, your title, and dates don't have to be there. You don't even have to have bullets. You can kind of list a few at the bottom, kind of in a bit more kind of stacked underneath. That's the best way for my more experienced candidates, where you won't get penalized for not having dates there because you already have them for the first 2 to 3 jobs. For what I would call emerging candidates, individuals that are probably in 0 to 5 years of their career, we can't make up that you've been somewhere for longer than that. So I think that you just want to make sure you're listing as many responsibilities as you can in the roles that you've held. And then that usually is a really good kind of way to make sure that you're filling up the page instead of trying to fill it up with fluff. You don't want to just have, spaces in between that aren't going to make sense. But I do think you want to make sure that you're adding the level of detail that's needed for the jobs that you're applying for. I hope that answered people's questions.
Is there a reasonable amount of time to go back? 10 years, 15 years, how far back is considered average?
Yeah, the average, whenever I was leading a different seminar, I was asked this question. There isn't an actual average. I think it's just dependent on how far do you want to go back based off of the jobs you're applying for, is the best way for me to answer that. If you are applying for a role that maybe 15 years ago, you really ran this specific department, and since then you've moved into a different type of role, but you have done it, you would want to make sure you're including that for this specific job. But there's no kind of average of going back 10 years, 15 years. It's just more dependent on where your experience lies and what you're wanting to showcase based off of the job that you're applying to. Any other questions, Colleen? Or
oh gosh, they're flying in kind of fast. Legare, sorry about this.
No worries. It's always helpful just to kind of stop for each slide, because I think that the resume is one of the hardest things, because you're never going to get consistent. When you do this, if you do A, B, you're going to be able to get to C, which equals a job. So I think that this is only my experience, and this is from what I'm hearing from hiring managers, but everyone is going to have different ways that they like different things done too.
Well, so we have a couple of emerging professionals who are asking some questions about putting presentations and conference history on their resume. Do they count? They want to put internships, but do they specify that it's an internship? And do they have to say if they were paid or unpaid? Do you have any thoughts on those? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. What can you ask me that first one again? Sorry about that.
Sure. So for some of our folks coming out of museum world, there's a lot of conferences and presentations that they have done. Is that a valid section to apply to put on your resume? And does that only apply to museums? Should that drop off with other positions?
That's a great question. So what I tell you, let me go with what won't work. You putting 8 bullet points under one conference, even in this space, because you always have to think about, again, is this going to make or break someone calling me? A lot of the conferences and presentations, it's more of a talking point, and being able to really say, I attended this conference, or I was a part of a panel for this. Having 1 or 2 bullet points under those, yes, those can be relative. Having 8 underneath it to describe it, probably not as relevant, unless it is a requirement of the job. Conferences and presentations are in addition. No one's been hired because they've attended this specific conference or they've presented on this panel. It is a nice value add, and that could definitely edge you above a different candidate for different roles. So I think that's usually where you want to use your best judgment and thinking, how much detail do I need? And will this be relevant for the job I'm applying for? If you're thinking outside of the museum space, you can add a section at the bottom, additional extracurriculars or additional information, where you can list attended XYZ conference, sat on panel, put in the parentheses the date. So again, if you are doing an interview, it's a light talking point instead of feeling like you're having to over explain it. And then I think that, yeah, go ahead, Colleen.
Sorry, do you feel the same way about publications?
Yes, publications, I think, again, putting a publication on there that could be relative, yes, please put that on there. You just don't need to go into a I just think about lines when I think about resumes, 3 lines about what it is. Because again, that's not going to make or break. Someone could look it up. If they see that and they're intrigued, they'll type it in and they'll spend 5 seconds doing that. But that's not going to make or break someone being able to really want to have a call.
Okay. And then internships, do we specifically call those out as paid or unpaid, or as internships, not a staff position?
Not in staff positions. So you don't need to delineate whether it's paid or unpaid. The only reason why you would do that is from a background check perspective, to be honest. And that's if you were presented the offer, that's when you would say they can verify my dates, but I was not a paid employee. You don't need to indicate the volunteer, whatever it may be. But I do think being able to showcase those and highlight those, if it's relative to the position that you're applying for, yes, internships for emerging professionals can definitely be relative.
Okay, I think that's good. Let's move on a little bit.
Yes, and if we need to come back, we can. This is usually one of the hotter topics to talk about. Helpful skills to show. Now we've talked a little bit about this, so we got a little bit of ahead. This is more at the bottom when it says skills. A lot of people put business development, marketing, content writing. Those have already been put on your resume, in your bullets, or in your actual objective. So I've always believed the skills should be certain databases, technical skills. You always have to think everyone could put they're organized and detail oriented. How? That's done on an interview. So the best way to really showcase on a resume, your skills section, your technical skills, this is where you could also put any specific, systems or databases that you've used, within your prior roles. If you're bilingual, trilingual, put in your languages here as well. But this is a really good area to kind of just stop and think, do I need 8 adjectives describing my background? Versus, is that going to really make or break someone calling me? So this is usually a really good way to more think about the technical components versus the intangible skill set, being organized and detail oriented and things like that. Now I will stop there and see if there are any specific questions to that, because I know we had talked about, this is where you can also put, instead of technical skills, you could put skills/achievements and have one line for your skills, and then underneath put presentations, publications. You can have, this is kind of the good area at the bottom of your resume to list those. Okay.
So we had one question, sorry, pop in. How should the examples be phrased? I can include specific examples from my resume.
So yes, let me explain that. The examples meaning more so from in your bullets. So if you were saying that in one of your roles, you had to really deal with, managing a team, your bullet should read more of an action item about, had to exercise strong judgment when it came to managing a team of 10 individuals by. That's the action item in the bullets, instead of at the bottom saying strong management skills. So that's kind of the difference between those two. So then when someone's reading through your bullets, you're able to actually, I always like to say, I want to create a picture. I don't know this specific museum, or I don't know this specific company that you worked for. So when you're able to kind of read through these bullets and start thinking about what am I picturing in my head? Those are kind of the actionable examples, not a specific example of on this one day I did this, but more of the examples to showcase some of the skills you might be listing at the bottom that are soft skills, instead of being able to add some of those and more actionable items in your bullet points. Did that help?
Yeah, one of the examples I have is used Microsoft Excel to build a comprehensive inventory of 150 plus objects. I was just wondering if that would be the right phrasing, or if I should try something more active or more descriptive.
I actually think, Alex, that's great. And I would still at the bottom put Microsoft Excel as one of your skills, because I do think that there sometimes that will be a word that, or one of the phrases we were talking about, where if the job you're applying for needs someone that has Excel on their resume, you'll get pulled. You would still get pulled if that's in your bullet, but you still want to have that technical skill set kind of at the bottom as well.
Okay,
Just a quick follow-up.
that's an easy fix. I just have Microsoft Office in general, so I can just swap that out to
You can just put that
Microsoft
into
Word,
the four.
Microsoft Excel.
Exact Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Outlook. I usually say Microsoft Office doesn't pull for Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Outlook. So you do want to list those. Sometimes people just put Microsoft Office Suite. It's better to put Microsoft Office in parentheses, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Outlook. Same if you're G Suite proficient, Slides. I can't remember the names for some of, I think that they're a bit different, but making sure that you're putting those in the parentheses to delineate those two.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Also ask a really quick follow-up. With the internships, what I meant to ask was, do you have to specify that they are internships, or can you just say like, I consulted, like not lying about like if you're asked directly if it's an internship, but just saying like, I worked there for 2 months, I was paid, I did the work of the staff.
Yeah. Usually I would say they're going to call and verify it from a background check standpoint anyway. So you can just put your title was intern. That's not going to make or break because they're going to see it was 2 months, but it's again going to be the depth of what you did during your internship that's really going to be the more important component. But having a title, whether it was summer intern, client relationship intern, whatever it may be, it's okay to have that title. That would never inhibit you from getting a job because it's core working experience too.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Legree, I found this question from Hillary really interesting. So
Okay.
when it comes to achievements, do you list those out in a separate section, or should they be grouped together within the job that they were achieved?
Yeah, that's it. I get this question a lot, and I'll tell you that is going to be dependent on your preference. That's never going to make or break someone calling you or not. Sometimes at the bottom, when you're thinking about your bullets, being able to have an achievement section. Now, if you have 8 bullets under achievements, I typically don't recommend that. I usually think at the bottom of what you've done, you end with notable achievements, maybe having 2 to 3 bullet points. From an achievement standpoint, if you won, employee of the month, something like that, those are nice to put into your bullets. But again, you don't want to have them be 8 to 10 bullets of all your achievements without them showing kind of the actual day-to-day core duties of what your job was as well.
How would you separate out school achievements or school projects or things like that?
Yep. So that's going to go underneath education, where you can put education, and then you'll kind of put where you attended college. And then underneath education, you can always add a line in of activities. And then you don't have to delineate college activities. It's right underneath education. So that should be fine. And again, you have to think about what's pertinent, what's relevant. Do you need to list every single committee you were involved in? Probably not. What are going to be the ones that are more, if you were asked in an interview, you could speak passionately about and that you liked? That's the best way to think about what is relevant to be putting on your resume.
Does the education section move depending on where you are in your career field?
That's always an interesting topic too. Typically, I usually say if you're 0 to 3 years out of school, keep education up top. If you're more than 3 years, put it at the bottom because you have the core 3 years of working experience. And again, you're going to get hired on what you've done. So I usually say that's when you want to invert it.
Okay, great. I think we're good for now. I'm going to.
Okay. All right. These are just other programs. This is, again, this is a bit less for y'all. These are from a bit more from an administrative standpoint. This is my typical seminar I do, and I changed a few things. There's a lot of these that maybe y'all have worked with or haven't worked with, but these are just different programs to think about. Now let's talk about the dreaded cover letter, one of the worst things outside of a resume, because when you think you have 7.5 seconds for someone to read your resume, you probably have 5 seconds for someone to hook you in on a cover letter, and that's an unfortunate reality. So I'm going to tell you again, this is my advice. Do not spend a week writing a cover letter. It is not worth it. It is not, it's something that is important because it's showcasing your writing skills, and they want to make sure that grammatically you are a strong writer and that you're able to explain why your background fits this job. But spending a week to 2 weeks reformatting and rethinking about all the things that you want to say it's not worth it. What I do think is helpful is reading the role that you are applying for. What skills are they looking for? And how can you highlight that in your cover letter? Here's a good example. Instead of I'm an organized or I'm a high functioning director that's run XYZ museum in Minneapolis, how are you high functioning? Think about what is it that you're able to add validity towards when you're saying and having a statement like that. I always say when someone asks you in an interview, so tell me your 3 strengths. Also a terrible interview question. That's when but people will just say, I'm organized, I'm punctual, and I'm easy to work with. And then a lot of the times there's no backing it up. So this is a really good way to think about the cover letter, similarly to if you're asked that question in an interview. I'm organized. For example, when I worked at so-and-so, I worked with a director that unfortunately was late to every single meeting. And for us to run staff meetings, she was notoriously known for being 15 minutes late. Here's how I was able to help this individual stay organized when I worked underneath them. And then here's how it was able to become more effective. And we were a more well-functioning team. This is helpful both from an interviewing standpoint, but both on a cover letter component. So it's really kind of thinking about, am I leaving anything on the table is probably a good way to say it, because I'm saying I'm organized or I'm a highly trained XYZ. How? What is this one example that you're able to back that up with? I'll stop right there, Colleen, because I think I saw a few things. Was there anything specific? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. As far as cover letters go, do you have any guidance on the organization of a cover letter? Vero has a question about, should you list bullets or should you focus more on narrative approach?
I usually always say narrative for cover letter, just because a cover letter they'll read through. A lot of companies do like to read through them, but it is going to be depend on kind of your hooker. I usually say the format. It's the similar format to what you would find online. You're addressing it to either the HR department or to the hiring manager. And then you're able to have kind of this A, B, C version. A is your intro paragraph, 3 sentences. B is your summary explaining why you're a good fit, 5 sentences. And then your exit explaining why you'd be excited about committing to an opportunity like this, 2 to 3 sentences. So again, nothing too much more from that standpoint, but I do think that that's a really good way to think about cover letters.
So if you have a serious amount of experience, like Jenny refers to 20 plus years of experience, how far back should you go with your achievements? Especially in a cover letter, if we've just talked about how your resume is going to kind of cut off, at a certain point, do you reference things that aren't specifically called out in your resume?
That's a great question. And you have to remember, a cover letter a lot of the times is read independently of your resume, which a lot of people don't know. A lot of people will see the resume and they'll back it up with the cover letter, but a lot of the times they're just reading the cover letter to assess, do they have the writing skills that we're looking for this particular position? So it's okay to reference things that aren't on your resume. But again, this is where you really want to read through the job and be thinking, what's the most pertinent for me to address based off of the qualifications of the role that I'm applying to. And it's okay if you don't have that listed on the actual core resume. If you have that in the cover letter and you're explaining, when I worked at XYZ for 10 years, here's the skill set that I learned, and here's how I know I could be successful in this particular role. That's usually a good way to describe it, but it doesn't have to be relevant, or it doesn't have to physically be on your resume for things that you'd be talking about in your cover letter. Does that help answer that?
I think so. Aaron had a quick question, so I'm just going to jump back just slightly, and then we can move on about gaps in employment on resumes. Is there a way to show activities undertaken during a gap? And then in addition, should the resume be chronological or focused on what you were doing specifically during the gap?
Yeah, I always believe in a chronological resume. You can change the one thing I will say, you don't need the same number of bullets for every job. I think a lot of people get that advice. You want 6 bullets here and 6 bullets here. If you had a shorter stint somewhere, you only need to have 2 or 3 bullets. Or if it wasn't your favorite job, or that's not the trajectory you want to go on, only have a few bullets. If you have a different job that's more relevant, add 15 bullet points underneath that particular component. of that stage of your life, because that's what you're going to want to talk about. And if that's the most pertinent for you to get hired, then that's what you want to be able to kind of talk about and explain. For gaps in employment, Erin, I just saw you raise your hand. For gaps in employment, you don't need to address, the one thing I will tell you, please never put stayed home to raise family. And the reason is no one needs to know that. That is no one's business. And I think that a lot of people have gotten advice, took time away for family, personal reasons, and that's okay. And if some people will add that in, if it's a 10 to 15 year gap, took personal time, great. From 2000 to 2010, took personal time. You don't need to over explain what you did in that. And then you can go back into kind of what you did past that. But people don't need to over explain gaps in their resume. It's just saying, when I left XYZ, I took some time and was able to spend time, whether it is with family, or I took some time for myself. And then after 10 years, I really was ready to move back into, running a museum, or being able to move into a director of fundraising role that was similar to my background. So it's not having to over explain it. No one's gonna, unfortunately, some people will probably question that, but I always believe explaining gaps when you speak with confidence, no one's going to question you. And it's all about how you say it. That's half of the battle. And going in interviews is being able to, the things that you feel the most nervous about, practicing in the mirror and hearing yourself say it. So then when it does come time in an interview, you're really confident. And then most people won't question, because you're speaking with this confidence, whether it's through a gap or through a phase of unemployment. When you're confident about it and you explain it in the right way, people typically respond very well to that.
So jumping real quick back to the cover letter. So Alina had a question about when you're highlighting the skills that you have within your cover letter, if you've only got, 5 or so sentences in that body and a long job description, we just focus on the have to haves and ditch the nice to have skills, or we only pick like 1 or 2 of those have to haves just for space, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the hard thing is, you have to remember, people don't want a full length cover letter. I think that's where you really have to assess, looking at the job description and thinking, what are the core fundamental components that this job needs, and really being able to play a parallel to what your background is. If you're able to get, sometimes you can combine 2 skills, whether it's someone that has the managerial skills as well as someone that is extremely organized. I'm just picking those 2. You can combine those 2 together in an example from your prior experiences. It's just making sure it's kind of the direct example that you'd be looking for. But I do think you don't want to be too wordy and explain all of the things of why you'd be a good fit. I think it's really making sure that you're able to explain the things that make the most sense and that read well when you're thinking about adding those things into a cover letter.
And how long would you say a cover letter should be then in general?
A full page, there should be some white space from the intro and who you're addressing it to. I usually say half a page, single spaced between the 3 paragraphs. Adding an additional paragraph in is totally fine. That's not going to make someone not, say this is too long of a cover letter. It's just remembering that a lot of the times the cover letters are important, but those aren't really going to they're assessing something different. They're not assessing, are you going to be a good fit for this job? Because then they will be looking at your resume too.
Is it okay to address a cover letter as to who it may concern?
I usually say that. Sometimes I say to whom it may concern, to hiring manager, to the attention HR department at XYZ, executive director. But if you're not sure who or where you're applying, being able to address it as to whom it may concern is totally fine.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Legare.
Yeah. So my favorite thing to talk about, interview prep. I'm going to go through these 2 things, then I'm going to go off cuff a little bit about explaining interviews. People over research, which is important, who you're meeting with. What does the company do? Why are you a good fit for this role, and why are you interested in this company and in this job? But I think that the biggest thing that people are struggling with right now is spending time with themselves and their resume, and they're over researching. So when you are getting asked questions and asking to go through your resume, you're not as confident. You're not able to explain some of these really strong examples that employers are really looking for right now. Most of these interviews right now and for the foreseeable future will be done remote. So companies are having to make hiring decisions based off of your presentation on Zoom, how you're explaining your experiences, and that needs to be backed up with specific examples. So the best piece of advice I would give everyone right now is really spending some time with your resume and going through bullet by bullet and thinking about when was a day in this particular bullet. Think about an example of it. Hardest day when this was tested. Your favorite, whether it was an accomplishment. Think about how could you say that in a way that's not a 5-minute spiel, but like you felt empowered when you were able to make this accomplishment. When you start thinking about those core examples, so then when someone says, you know, Legare, walk me through your resume, they've already read through your bullets. What's not on there? And those are the examples, and that's what you really want to be providing. There's something to be said about, I was the executive director for a small children's museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And then adding that up with, we were a 50-person operation. I helped lead a team of 25 from a direct report standpoint. This was definitely a step up from my prior role. I think the biggest thing I learned from that in the first few months was just in the first 10 seconds, whoever I would be interviewing with is immediately starting to picture this 50-person children's museum in Charleston, South Carolina. I was the executive director. Here's a core intangible skill set that I was able to take on from my prior role. And then you start going into kind of the core fundamental day-to-days. So I think when you really spend some time with your own resume and start thinking about it from that standpoint, favorite day, hardest day, biggest thing you learned, biggest takeaways, and then really thinking about these tangible examples when you're looking at your bullets too, you're creating a story. You're not reading like a robot and going through your resume. You're creating a story of what you did. And I think what's hard for candidates right now, especially for individuals who maybe were at the same firm, company, museum for 15 years, it's hard to figure out, what do you say in 15 years? Well, I did everything. I started here and then I've moved up here. How do you put that in a digestible format? But when you're able to really come in and think about, well, let me just think about my bullets. How can I phrase a bit of this picture and create a bit more of these actionable examples so the interviewer will say, that's exactly what I was looking for. This is actually a very big part of the job. Let me walk you through a little bit about that. You're able to get some more core nuggets of information for the job that you'd be interviewing for as well, just by the examples that you've been able to provide too. Now, there's another big thing, and this is why I have this bullet in here. Why do you want to work for this company and why this role? There are a lot of people that stumble with this question. So this is the most important thing when you're going on, even if it's a networking conversation with someone that might have an opportunity at some particular place, making sure it fits into your background. There's a big difference. And I've always been interested in this museum. I've always been interested in this company. Why? How? Really be thinking about, are your answers enough? Are you giving them enough information? So when you're saying, why do you want to work for this company? Well, here are 3 specific things, whether it was a recent article that you read and it really sat with you based off of who you are and what's important to you. Is it that you really particularly feel connected to their mission? And then why this role? Now, this is where people get tripped up because so many people, when they say, well, why this position? They'll answer, why this company? So make sure that when you're reading through the job description, you have 2 to 3 sentences to why this job is the right fit for you based off of your background too. And I'll stop right there because I know that's a lot of information, but any questions or anything that you feel like that come from that?
I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat just yet.
That sounds good. Usually I like to kind of, especially with this, it is a lot of information. And it is also, it's a different way of thinking about interviewing. I give seminars all over the country. It's called Practice Your Pitch. And it's basically how to answer the dreaded question, tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, without knowing how to do it. And I think, again, when you're able to frame it from what mental picture am I able to create to the interviewer, by focusing on tangible examples, it will completely change your interview game and also make you feel really confident in your background because you're describing experiences instead of things that are already on your resume too.
Well, we did have Leanne pop in with how do you recommend answering the dreaded, what is your biggest weakness question?
I hate that question. And I love that every company still loves to ask that question right now. And I'm like, why? Why do you need to ask that question? And if I get the answer, I'll make sure I'll send it out. But usually answer it with something that's real. I think a really good one is, and one that I've always believed, and especially I'm sure in y'all's line of work, is when you run a museum or working in any particular component in that space, you're a yes person. There's not enough people to do every single job. You sometimes have 10 to 15 jobs within your one role. And so a really good weakness for a lot of my candidates are, I found early in my career, I just wanted to say yes to everything and I took everything on. And it was harder for me to be able to prioritize what actually I was able to get done. So something I've really been able to be, and so then you can say, but I've been working on this, not saying, but I fixed it and it's not a weakness, because that's not what they're looking for. But you do want to say, in my career, here's something I've always been really cognizant of, knowing that this is part of who I am as a person. And here's how I've been able to help counteract that. Those are usually the best ways to answer it. And then I always just say, the more honest you can be, the better, with action items of how you're trying to better yourself too.
Have you noticed any new like classic questions that have popped up in regards to interviewing during the pandemic?
Classic questions? No, because everyone's still asking the same questions. I do think it's always, walk me through your resume, why this job, strengths and weaknesses. I do think something that a lot of people will be asking right now, and this just depends on if people are in person or not. How do you build relationships with colleagues and managers if you're not going to be able to physically see them every day? So I do think that is a question that's popped up, just given we're in a new remote landscape. There's no right or wrong way to answer that, but that is one that I feel like I've been hearing more often than not, to be honest.
We do have kind of a niche question from Katerina. So for designers, is there a preference on how to present a portfolio for in-person interviews, printed versus digitally on a tablet?
So I would usually, if they've asked for your portfolio, it is okay in your email response back to ask what their preference is. I usually always recommend asking, because some companies are really big about their footprint when it comes to paper, so they'd rather you send it digitally, where others, if it is going to be in person, they might want you to print it. So I usually would ask, if they're saying, please bring your portfolio, when you're responding and confirming the interview, you can say, I'm looking forward to meeting you on XYZ date at XYZ time. I would like to ask, is your preference for me to physically bring a copy of my portfolio, or would you like for me to digitally send it for us to go through together? Totally okay to ask. And I think it's usually better to ask than just assume or send both.
Well, jumping back to our dreaded questions, how do you handle the where do you see yourself in 5 years question?
It's also one of the worst questions. That's usually a trick question, because a lot of companies are looking for employees that are loyal and are looking to make a commitment to an organization. So I usually say the best way to answer that is that, well, my hope is that I'm with the same firm for the next 5 years. I'm looking to find a home, or I'm looking to be able to find an opportunity where I can really, really commit to. And then you kind of want to make it catered towards the job that you're interviewing for, and the company that you're interviewing for. But my favorite kind of little tip is always start with, like, in 5 years, I hope that I'm with the same XYZ company. Don't say the company you're interviewing for, because sometimes they're like, oh, you don't have the job. But I think when you can say, well, ideally, I'd like to be at the same place, that's usually a good way to start it, and then make it a bit more tailored.
Okay, well, we're down to about 10 minutes, so I think it's
Okay.
probably smart to jump to our next
Sure.
topic.
This is very pertinent because this is virtual interview tips. I spoke and was featured in an article a few weeks ago about Zoom interviews. Do you need backgrounds? How close to the camera you need to be? All of the things that everyone, you're going to get different pieces of advice from. Number one, test your Zoom or your WebEx. Have a friend that is your go-to interview person, that just you are able to make sure that you always have the right connection. There's nothing kind of crazy in the background. Your lighting looks good. I think all of those things are important. A clear background is important. I have seen some awesome, hysterical virtual backgrounds that I have loved. I would definitely not recommend those for an interview. The one thing with those is you can kind of look, depending on what it is, that you're half a person if you move your body too much. So I usually just recommend the clearer, the better. Usually nothing that's too crazy behind you. A painting is fine. A doorway is okay if the door's closed, but less is more from behind you because you want the focus to be on you and you're interviewing. I would tell you, I'm a bit too close to the camera. It's just how my at-home workspace is. I typically would say being able to have from here or from your head down a little bit more torso wise. So then you're able to have a bit more of they're assessing kind of your presence as you're interviewing is also great. Anything too close, you feel like you're talking to someone like that. So usually I recommend a little bit farther away too. I've loved seeing a lot of my candidates and clients' pets and kids. If that does happen on an interview, it has happened to everybody. I was meeting with the CEO a few weeks ago and his cat jumped up on his lap and he just went with it. And so people will recognize that. To the best of your ability, try not to have that happen. If it does, apologize once and say, I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting this. And then be able to kind of just move right into the next thing. It's more about the reaction than anything. And the pop-ups and sounds, making sure you're turning off your phone, putting yourself on do not disturb. If someone is a constant communicator that's in your life, telling them do not contact me and give yourself a 2-hour window, even if you told them if you have do not disturb on. Those are just really good tips to make sure you're distraction free so you can be really focused on an interview too. Do any questions pop up in that, Colleen?
Well, a comment, and not necessarily a question, but it leads me to think, how would you handle if you're having internet issues or connectivity issues, things that are outside your control?
Totally. That's a great question. If that does happen, you just apologize once. Sometimes if they can't see you, the video doesn't work, or there's some type of issue, immediately with who you're corresponding with, if the video isn't connecting, but someone else set the interview up, immediately email them from your phone. I'm so sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. I tested this earlier this morning. If you can please let XYZ know, I'm working to figure it out within the next 5 to 10 minutes. I will email you back if that does not happen. It's thinking about what is the action plan that you're able to communicate so then they know that you're on it. It's not just things aren't working. It's here's what my steps are, and I'll make sure to circle back once I'm able to either figure it out or we need to reschedule.
Yeah, I've had that happen to me twice in interviews. I had one where the video didn't work, but the audio did. So the video didn't work on my end. I could see them, they couldn't see me. So we just had to figure it out. This was pre-pandemic. And then for some reason I couldn't figure out, the video kicked right back on at the end. So,
and that's the hard thing is like during right now, we're living in this tech world where things happen and it's more about how you react to it. So if there is an issue, you just say, I'm so sorry. I tested this earlier. Let me just see if you can just give me 1 minute to try to see if I can fix what the issue is. If not, are you comfortable doing this without video? If not, I'm happy to reschedule. It's your cadence and how you handle it and your communication that usually is able to, because everyone understands that, especially in the virtual kind of world that we're living in right now.
The second time was back in, I want to say September or October. I was doing an interview and someone tried to make a Zoom call on the same account, so it just automatically bounced this out. So I just went straight to my email to the address I had, sent something that the interview was interrupted. What can I do to try and resolve it? And we got it fixed in about a minute. So we were able to pick up, and I just sent ignore the previous email. The issue's been resolved.
Yeah, and I think that it's always about what are you communicating? I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from something like that for sure. Alrighty. And then let me just see, I can't remember what my last one is. Yes, interview follow-up tips. There needs to be thank you notes. Being from down south, I always hand wrote my thank you notes, but that is not the world that we are living in right now. I think that if you don't have the email address for the individual that you interviewed with, feel free to send it to whoever it was you were communicating with that helped coordinate that, saying, can you please pass this note along to so-and-so on my behalf? The biggest thing that I'm hearing from clients right now is that the thank you notes, if they read them, they seem generic. Could they have sent this to anyone? So the most important thing, the minute you end any interview, before you call anybody, friend, family member, spouse, your recruiter, take 5 minutes and jot down what were the things that we connected on. Did we have some type of common connection? I love when people write thank you notes to me and they're like, I just recently came back from Charleston. I love that you're named after a street, whatever it may be. How are you adding value, and how are you going to remember that individual? And I think that that's important, that the person that's interviewing you wants to read that thank you note and be like, gosh, we did have such a great conversation. Like, and I really would love to move them forward to the next step. That is a really good follow-up as the interviewer is assessing how did the interview go and making sure it's detailed and specific, but not again sending 3 paragraphs, but specific enough to showcase that you were actively listening and that you were able to take away a few components from that too. Any questions on thank you notes?
Legare, just in general, can you talk a little bit about making those personal connections, whether it's through your interview or through your thank you note as a follow-up? You know, what's reasonable, what's too much, what's overbearing?
Right. Yeah, let me go to the overbearing type, because sometimes I've gotten a thank you note that's been 2 pages for like a 20-second phone screen. So I would say probably not that. But I do think that there is this cadence where you want to make sure that you are not over talking what you already spoke about. So I usually say thank you notes are a great thank you note is 7 to 8 sentences. Now, if you've gone through 8 rounds of interviews and you're meeting the executive board, typically making sure that those are really tight, still the 7 to 8 sentences are fine. But I always say address the name of the company and then also the title of the position that you're applying for. So thank you so much for the opportunity to interview for the staffing consultant position at Beacon Hill Staffing Group. I really enjoyed connecting on our Southern connection and both being Chi Omegas, whatever it may be, adding that line in if it did come up. If it didn't come up, that's fine. Just think about what else did y'all talk about that was relevant to the job that you'd be able to put into your thank you note too. Phil talked about you really needed someone that was fantastic in Adobe Suite. Then you say, I really enjoyed our conversation today. Based on our discussion, I know that your so-and-so is really looking for an individual that's proficient in Adobe. I'm confident in my skill set that I could hit the ground running based off of my prior experiences, specifically at so-and-so. That's the best way to do it without, again, over talking any of those points. But I think the 7 to 8 sentences is usually a really good kind of like framework for a really healthy thank you note.
I think we're going to make this our last question. So I have had some people who've asked about how to contact you after today.
Yeah.
So I would love to make sure we share that information.
Yes.
But then just as a really quick follow-up, so when you send in your application, some companies will automatically generate we've received your application, it's complete, thanks so much, we'll let you know. Some don't send you anything.
Right.
So is it appropriate to try to follow up and just make sure that your application was received? And sometimes they say, so, right in the job description, don't contact us.
Don't contact us.
Yeah.
So whenever they're like, we know we've gotten everything, you're like, but you haven't. Did you get back to me? Like, did you not? So I do think that that's always a really interesting one. And there's not going to be a right or wrong answer to that, to be honest with you. I think that let me answer and start answering it. If you've interviewed and you were waiting to hear back, and they say it is totally okay at the end if you're meeting with HR or some type of I would say I wouldn't email the executive director this question, but someone that's probably in the first round of interviews, your final question can be, and I'd love to understand a bit more of the timeline regarding the hiring for this particular role. Let them talk and say, great. So if they say we should be able to get back to you within the next 2 weeks, you set a reminder in 2 weeks, no earlier than that, to then say, I just wanted to follow up regarding the executive director position. I remain highly interested in this role. I'm still in the early stages of my interview process, so I'm looking forward to hearing any next steps you might have. Totally fine. Now, from an application standpoint, it's really hard to know if you have a friend in the company or if you have a contact. That's usually the best way to follow up to make sure your application is being reviewed. I typically wouldn't suggest going in and following up after you've submitted an application to see if they've received it. Typically they have. It's just sometimes they might be looking for a different type of candidate, or it's maybe not a priority hire for them and they have different things that are priorities for them. But I do think the more important component is the cadence of follow-up after an interview. The day after, no, you need to give it. That's why having that question kind of right at the end. So walk me through. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your kind of the hiring timeline. And even if you feel it's appropriate, if you have this great connection and the person is saying, well, we're thinking about this in 2 weeks. You say, great, is it okay if I follow up with you in about 2.5 weeks if I haven't heard from you? Totally fine. 100% okay to ask that question, because then you're giving yourself this cadence and timeline. So I do think that those components are more important to talk about. And I know it's tricky because I've been hearing from a lot of my candidates, and I feel for so many people looking for a job right now is you can send 50 resumes and not hear back one thing. So what is the point? How are you supposed to be following up whenever you are not following up? And I know that we're about to be out of time, but the one thing I would say, especially in this market right now, making sure you're using your network. This is a wonderful format of people know a lot of people. And I think making sure you're having genuine connections. And if you are asking people for a 15-minute conversation, not thinking about what can I get from this person, but making sure that there's some type of synergy between the two of you and you're able to ask what that person needs from you or how you could be of a benefit to that individual is the best way to really be having these networking conversations and to have jobs kind of be opening up to you in this market.
That's a great place to close, I think. And Legare, thank you so much for all of the information you shared today. This was incredibly rich and I think hopefully provided a lot of really helpful information for participants today. So thank you so much for sharing your time. A couple of quick reminders for folks. Again, if you have not yet done so, register on museumexpert.org. So you'll get our e-newsletter and announcements about future events. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We are planning our next webinar for Wednesday, March 24th. And that webinar is actually going to focus on how to make the most of your network to support your job search. So great follow-up to today's conversation. And we will share the recording of today's webinar and encourage you to share that with friends and colleagues who might benefit from this information as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And I posted a link in the chat to a short evaluation. We'd really appreciate your feedback on today's presentation.
And I'll make sure that y'all have my contact information and feel free to send that out. And just, I always say, give me about 48 hours to respond. But I'll always make sure to either respond and set up a call if you're interested in having a call with myself, or make sure if you're looking in a different city that I can put you in touch with my counterpart in that city as well. And I really appreciate y'all's time. This was one of my favorite things to talk about. And as y'all can probably tell, I speak with a lot of enthusiasm, so I can talk about it all day, every day. So I hope everyone has a great week, and thank you again for putting this on. And Ellen, thank you too.
Thank you, and this is Walter, and I want to take the opportunity to thank you, because it was amazing, and all the comments in the chat were in the same direction. So I think that everybody is going to try to share that with as loudly as possible. But I also want to thank the people of my team, Tamara for introducing and setting the scene, and Colleen for doing a great job in bringing the questions to you. So we have a great team. So if you want to join, we're still open for you. So to welcome you. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.